Thank you, Betsy, and thank you, Jackie and Sean, and everyone who's participating in the activity of prayer this morning. Oh my goodness, guess what? Because I'm on Zoom, I'm going to try and practice raising our vibration and getting better at telling jokes. It so happens that the one this morning is from Seinfeld, and it aligns with both the message that's coming through today, as well as the opening hymn that asked, "What am I? I cannot be defined. I'm the thinker." And those thoughts become, as we know, words in action. So Seinfeld says that the problem with talking is that nobody stops you from saying the wrong thing. He says, I think life would be a lot better if it was like you're always making a movie. And so when you mess up, somebody just walks on the set, stops the whole shot. I mean, think of the things that you said you wish you could take back. So, you're out somewhere with people and meet someone you know and say, boy, you look pregnant. Are you? Cut. That's not going to work at all. Walk out the door, come back in, take that whole scene again. And then he says, people, think about what you're saying. Indeed. Well, it's really a joy to be together here this morning, isn't it? It's always different when I shift to Zoom. And so I miss being with all of you who are there in the sanctuary, and I'm so grateful for the support that I feel and the love that I feel on Zoom. So our true nature, as the hymn reminded us, probably cannot be defined. What am I? I cannot be defined. But what I know from the message that is coming through for me this morning, and that I'm so privileged and honored to share with all of us, is that our true nature is spirit. Our true nature is divine. And from that spiritual nature comes power, comes spiritual power. Kind of interesting that the metaphysical Bible story that I felt guided to understand better for myself this week, the story of the wheat and the tares from the many parables of Jesus, is, I believe, a parable that has been used in traditional ways of teaching it that is very limited and limiting. The wheat and the tares. Right away there we have the contrast, duality. In fact, more closely examined, this parable is rich in what most parables have, which is a prescription, a formula for right and holy living. I find it interesting that this particular parable that comes from the book of Matthew, where Jesus is teaching, chapter 13, verses 24 to 30, and then when he is finished and he goes back with his students inside, this is one of the rare occasions when Jesus gives somewhat of an explanation, only because his students literally say to him in Matthew, can you explain the parable of the wheat and the tares? And so we will look at what the master does and says to elucidate this scripture at depth with its profound meaning waiting for us to glean. And so from Matthew chapter 13, verses 24 to 30, and then 34 to 36 is when they ask for further clarification. Jesus related another parable to them, saying, "The kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed good seed in his field. And while men slept, his enemy came and sowed tares among the wheat and went away. And when the blade sprang up and bore fruit, then also the tares appeared. So the servants of the landowner came to him and said, "Our Lord, behold, did you not sow good seed in your field? From whence came the tares into it?" And the landowner said to them, "An enemy did this." And his servants then asked him, "Do you want us to go out and pull them out?" But he said to them, "It might happen that while you are pulling out the tares, you might uproot them, with them also the wheat. Let them grow together until the harvest. And at the harvest season, I will say to the reapers, pick out first the tares and bind them into bundles. Pick out first the tares to bind them into bundles and burn them, and gather the wheat into my barns." That's it. The wheat goes into the barns and the tares go to be burned. And so perhaps some of you had been exposed in your previous training to the traditional interpretation of this parable, which is that, those who are good will be saved and those who are bad will be punished accordingly. And so it was that when Jesus left the multitudes, this is verse 36 in chapter 13, when Jesus left the multitudes and went into the house, his disciples came up to him and said, "Explain to us the parable of the tares and the field." And so Jesus answered, saying to them, "He who sowed good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world. The good seed are the sons of the kingdom, and the tares are the sons of evil. The enemy who sowed them is Satan. The harvest is the end of the world, and the reapers are the angels. Therefore, just as the tares are picked out and burned in the fire, so shall it be at the end of the world." It's significant that Jesus focuses on a couple of the images from his original parable in trying or in attempting to shed light on the deeper message for all of us that still resonates since Jesus told it. More importantly, in terms of understanding Jesus drawing the connection between the end of the world and what it signifies in a metaphysical larger realm, the end of the world signifies those times in life when something, anything in us reaches a cycle of completion. The end of the world represents a phase of growth within us, a cycle of development. We know that all of the symbolism that is rich in parables really represent, in one way or another, the processes or the cycles within our individual lives. When I reviewed that metaphysical understanding of the end of the world, I recognized how very rich in their universality and their timelessness that these parables are. I am sure that I have taught delved into and explored the metaphysics before of this well-known parable. And yet what it spoke to in me this time, amazingly, is very different than anything I remember before. And of course, whether I'm teaching the metaphysics of Bible or symbolism in literature or in poetry that has stood the test of time, its merit is evident in the fact that it is changeless, it is timeless, it remains universal in its relevance for our individual lives. And each time that we come back to it, because we are ever evolving, because we are ever expanding and growing in consciousness and understanding, a different message, a different truth resonates in us as we come back to what is still the same story. And so, in terms of truly appreciating the metaphysics contained in this story of the wheat and the tares, let us consider that right at this moment, right now, in this moment, in each of our lives, we are in a certain phase or cycle or stage of unfoldment towards conscious perfection. So let's just stop and take that in for a moment. What stage or phase of unfoldment might we be in at this moment in our unfoldment in consciousness of perfecting our understanding? Each of us at any given time is growing through a cycle of learning, of growing, of developing. And right now, in this moment, as we embrace that growth, that unfoldment, that evolution of our soul, we recognize that there are probably at least 4 aspects of this. We might be availing ourselves of an opportunity to make a choice of some kind in our lives. So that's part of evolving, right? We may have a choice, an opportunity that has come up for us to make a choice. The second kind of experience we might be having in consciousness is that we're in the midst of already making a choice. So we are making a choice at this moment in our lives. The third possible stage is that we are awaiting the results of a choice that we have already made. The final stage is meeting those results. So let me just review those 4 so that we can perhaps more fully take away the message of this parable and how it applies to our individual lives. This is truly the function and the purpose and the richness of metaphysically understanding the Bible, is that it gives us, as I said in my introduction, a prescription, a formula that works for our individual experiences. So whether we are availing ourselves right now of an opportunity for a choice that we might make, or we are in the midst of already making that choice. Third, perhaps we are awaiting the results of having made a choice. Or fourth, we are actually meeting and living with the results of a choice. Now, we know from having been through these various phases of growth and development that these phases can intermingle, they can mix, they can blend, but we are at any given moment somewhere within it. What I find really fascinating that I don't remember coming across before in this parable is that if you look up the specific type of weed that a tare is, T-A-R-E, It is a weed that resembles wheat. How interesting that it is not a weed that is immediately recognizable. It's not a weed that grows amongst the wheat that is discernible by contrast to the wheat in how it looks. Now, is there any accident in the fact that those were the particular weeds planted in this field of wheat? No. We access and activate our spiritual power of discernment, of divine judgment, when we are seeking to identify those things in our spiritual growth, in our choices that we make that are either weeds or the wheat. Our current cycle that we are living in is really our world. And the phase in that cycle is our age at this time, but neither will last or endure. The cycle that we may find ourselves in will not last. The age that we find ourselves at will not endure. All of this will eventually come to a fulfillment, a conclusion. And this conclusion is what is represented when the Bible uses that phrase, the end of the world. It is the consummation, the completion of a phase in our individual unfoldment. And so in terms of this parable, what Jesus is teaching is that when a certain purpose in our lives has been fulfilled, or a choice has been made, has been met and used in the overall pattern of our unfoldment, then we have identified what is the wheat and what is the tare. But wherever we are in this current cycle of living and learning, it's interesting to notice that there is one thing that all of us are unified by. There's something in common that unites us, that joins us in this current cycle of living and learning that seems individualistic for each one of us, depending on where we find ourselves. There is the common trait. What we have in common with everyone else's current cycle of unfoldment is that we all notice that all cycles contain elements that seem good or bad, pleasant or unpleasant. There are always these contrasting factors in any growth cycle, right? Things that we call in our humanity desirable, undesirable. Oh, this represents pleasure. This is painful. Oh, this is very satisfying, but this is disappointing in my life. Or in Jesus's language, these are the wheat and the tares, the contrast represented by what the ego wants to continuously find a label for. And it is a simple truth. It is an essential fact of life that this duality, that this two-sided perception of whatever might be happening for us at any cycle in our lives will contain both. So we might, in our current field of living, discover any number of difficult or unpleasant circumstances. And of course, the question how or why that the servant asks, you remember, the landowner in the parable echoes down through the millennia, through the ages. Forever have we in our humanness questioned, I'm a good truth student. I try to live a good life. How did these tares get here? Whence came these weeds? And so it is that the question becomes, There are tares in my field. There are difficult things, unpleasant things, unsatisfying things, disappointing things in the field of my existence. Is there something wrong with me? And of course, that question we know has only one answer. The only thing that is ever really wrong is asking the question, is there anything wrong with me? And thereby we return to the title of this talk, which is our essential nature, our true identity is spirit. And when we can surrender to that true identity, trust and have patience that this is the truth of us, we understand Jesus's illustration that at our current level of human understanding, life will appear to have a duality of appearances, of experiences, and that it is only human initially to react and to judge them, in terms of black and white, all or nothing, positive or negative, good or bad. The wheat and the tares in our lives are these factors growing and mixed up all together, often showing up mixed up in just one given experience. Rather than react to them, you notice it's very significant that the first thing that the servants ask after they say why, so many of you have heard me say that asking why is the portal to hell. So of course, their first question, and that's the first question we can be gentle with ourselves about too. Why me? Oh, the things that I've seen. The idea being that asking why can come up, we brush it away. And rather than going into victimhood and second guessing and asking if there's something wrong with us, we can then notice, just be the objective observer of the next thing that comes up, humanly, understandably. And that's captured metaphysically in the next question of the servants, which is, hey, do you want us to just go and pull them out? We can go and pluck out those tares. And so this gives rise again to the understanding that there are not good and bad things in growing in this field. We know that Shakespeare wrote, there is nothing good or bad, but thinking makes it so. And so what we need to understand at this juncture is the validity. How valid is it to call certain things in our lives good, pleasant, wonderful, desirable, and to label others differently? We can follow the lead of Jesus, who in Mark 10, verse 8, very clearly says, why are you calling me good? There is no one good save one. So if Jesus himself does not accept the label of good in this human realm, how much more should we be vigilant at the door of our consciousness to hesitate to call things bad, good, wrong, right, desirable, or undesirable? In terms of this natural, or at least it seems natural, a natural impulse would be to immediately engage our spiritual power to have clear discernment. But an automatic response is to, based on our personal filters, our personal experiences, opinions, and judgments, we go into calling these things good and bad. And yet, to take responsibility for that temptation is to be reminded of the scripture in John 8:7, where we are told, advised by Jesus, let him who is without sin cast the first stone. And so we refrain from judging something, from this knee-jerk reaction of judging stuff in our field as good or bad. We must be very careful. Remember, those tares actually resemble the wheat. And so we know that our human tendency is to be violently hasty, as you see the serpents being, hey, want us to just go and pluck them out? That might be our first impulse as well, to take the bull by the horns, to immediately move into action. Pause. Access our true power, our spiritual power. Remember what is true. Oh, that's right. God's will for me is only good. And nobody wants their lot or their field or their consciousness cluttered with undesirable stuff, things, circumstances, experiences. Yes, that's true. But let us not be like the serpents who impulsively, reactively want to pluck them right out. Notice what the wise landowner responds to their wanting to immediately go and pull the weeds out. He says to wait for the right moment. It is interesting that he doesn't say this, but certainly in the baby stages of growth, the weeds, the tares, and the wheat might really be difficult to differentiate and to distinguish. It is only at the time of harvest when separating the wheat and the tares will become easier. And so let's just apply this once again as a formula, as a prescription, for every moment of our lives. When we remember our true identity, our true nature is spirit, when we recall that we have access at all times to spiritual discernment, then we will be able to tell the tares from the wheat. And then it will be that the wheat can be appropriately utilized and the tares can be properly disposed. Hopefully for all of us at this moment, the huge difference between the way this parable was traditionally used to threaten people to behave, to be good, as if there was a good model to be attained, versus being bad, which would result in your burning eternally in hell. Clearly, we are to uproot any of the tares that are in our belief system under the guidance of the Father. You remember when his students said, can you kind of go back and explain that business about the wheat field with the tares in it? That Jesus brings angels into it, the reapers versus the angels. The angels, we know, represent messages of God. And yet we are continually making choices to ask for that guidance, to put ourselves under the direction and governance of God through prayer, or impulsively reacting before things have really had a chance to develop. And certainly most of us have been through enough experiences in life that we can call a file up that might be a time when we reacted like the servants who wanted to rip the weed out right away. And heaven only knows what might have developed had we been patient and waited. And yet we take this prescription, this formula from this parable, and carry it forth into the rest of this day, the rest of this week, and lean on our current understanding of this parable. Because what Jesus is doing in this parable is describing, depicting, explaining a spiritual law which works unfailingly. When I fully trust it and cooperate with it, when I can remain patient and wait for the guidance that comes through the still small voice that I recognize, then the tares will be taken care of in due time. It's interesting with, the advent of The Secret, that movie that suddenly explained to people, you are in charge of the what, not the how. That formula of our self being in charge of making the choice, but the actual work, the accomplishment of that choice, never being done by the self, has the same teaching because it is truth and it is timeless as what The Secret put out to the masses. You are in charge of making a choice. Take your hands off the wheel when it comes to the how. And so the self does nothing but makes the choice. It is our spiritual nature, our spiritual power. It is working with that which is always greater than that in the world. And that self is the Christ self. And that is our real nature. And that is where the real power resides. If we can just look beyond the appearances, just recognize that sometimes the tares and the wheat that's fledgling can be confused one with the other. It is when we are seeking to look beyond appearances and we're still not seeing anything good, as we want to label it, that we must rest in spirit. Rest and trust in spirit. The last part of this formula that comes from the tares and the wheat that applies to our everyday lives is that some of that wheat, the good part that is consumed for immediate substance, is not all of it. That's not all of it. A lot of it is also harvested for replanting. And it is from that replanting that comes the eternal outpouring of blessings from within, from the divine, from our spiritual nature. And so it is that we know that words of truth, when they are planted in our consciousness or shared with another, are planted for further multiplication. And so it is that the goodness of God can only be expressed in the world, in and through each of our willingness to wait instead of sifting through everything that's going on with reactivity. We wait on the Lord and we will be lifted up. So it is.